I don't think there's anybody better that we could bring on right now to really share with you guys and gals the impact of these technologies, of what's possible for the future, of where we can take this, of the Powur 20-year vision of what's possible for each and every one of our business, than Tony Seba. So in just a minute, you're all going to meet Tony. We're so excited, Tony, that you're here. Now, if you don't know Tony, Tony is a world-renowned thought leader, author, speaker, educator, angel investor, and Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He's the author of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation, Solar Trillions, and Winners Take All. He's the co-author of Rethinking Transportation, Rethinking Food and Agriculture, and Rethinking Humanity. He's been featured in several movies and documentaries, including Bloomberg's Forward Thinking, A Sustainable World 2040, and Sungauge. He's the recipient of many awards, including the Savvy Award 2019, the Solar Future Today's Visionary Influencer Award 2018, the Clean Energy Action's 2017 Sunshine Award, and he's the creator of the Seba Technology Disruption Framework. His work focuses on technology disruption, the convergence of technologies, of business model innovation, and product innovation that is leading to the disruption of the world's major industries. He's been a keynote speaker at hundreds of global events and organizations, including Google, the European Commission, Davos, COP21, CLSA, JP Morgan, the National Governors Association, the Conference on World Affairs, the Global Leaders Forum, Intersolar. He's taught thousands of entrepreneurs and corporate leaders at Stanford Continuing Studies. He has a Stanford MBA and an MIT degree in computer science and engineering. Mr. Tony Seba, we are so grateful, so honored to have you here, my friend. How are you doing this morning?
Doing great. Thank you. So good being here.
Oh, Tony, we appreciate you so much. And I just want to say personally, the impact that your work had on my life and on the vision of Powur and on really helping us clarify the direction that we needed to take this company and really, you know, what was possible for us. So thank you so much, Tony. From the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you.
It's my pleasure.
And without further ado, I will get out of your way.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, the Powur team. We're on the cusp of the fastest, deepest transformation of civilization in history. In the 2020s, essentially over the next 10 years, key technologies will converge to completely disrupt the 5 foundational sectors of the economy. And with them, every other sector across the board: energy, transportation, information, food, materials. These are the 5 sectors that have transformed humanity throughout history. The implications for these disruptions are dramatic. Geopolitics, cities, everything will be transformed. Production costs will fall by 10x. Waste is going to fall by about 10x. And just for the record, this is not another industrial revolution. This is a transformation for humanity to potentially the age of freedom. Today, and over the last 10,000 years, we have lived in a world that I call the extraction system of production, where the building blocks are coal and oil and gas and livestock. But what we're about to create is a creation system of production, where the building blocks are photons and electrons and bits and DNA. For the first time in history, we'll be able to solve the world's most intractable issues at once and at a fraction of the cost that we're paying now for the existing system. So let me walk you first through the history of humanity in 5 minutes. So for about 200,000 years, or so, humanity, human beings, could only organize about 100 people at a time. This is what I call societal capabilities. So the largest human settlement size was about hundreds, and that did not change for hundreds of thousands of years. And then suddenly, about 10,000 years ago, something happened. And over the last 10,000 years, we have increased. So societal capabilities is what we're capable of achieving, how many people we can clothe and feed and fuel. That's societal capabilities. The largest settlement size went up from 100 to 1,000, and then 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, and we're now in the tens of millions. What has enabled all of these dramatic changes to society? Two things, essentially, in Rethinking Humanity, we looked at all of this history, and there are fundamentally two things. The production system, which is essentially what we use to energy, transportation, materials, how we harness nature and actually people. The sad thing about the last 10,000 years, the extraction system of production, is that it's an exploit or be exploited system. It's a zero-sum competition, which has driven a growth imperative, right? You can't just stay quiet and meditate and be happy because you know somebody's gonna come and eat your lunch. That's the extraction system. The organizing system is how we think, is how we, our models of thought and beliefs and institutions, our taxes and regulations and subsidies. It's how we organize society. Throughout history, the leading civilizations, those who dominated the world or their world, had the best fit, the best combination of the production system and the organizing system. And of course, geography was key throughout history. Now, I'll give you two examples. Sumer, which essentially Uruk, the first modern city, about 6,000 years ago, they invented writing itself. It's amazing that humanity went without writing for hundreds of thousands of years. They started using copper, draft animals, and so on. These are the 5 foundational, basically sectors of the economy. And they had 10x improvements in all 5. But it wasn't just the technologies. It's the organizing system. It's a belief system. They were the ones who started hierarchies, credit, tax, specialized militaries, and so on. So it was that combination that allowed them to increase societal capabilities by more than 10x. Rome, as we know, they also had key technologies in the 5 foundational sectors. Concrete, they were the first ones to invent or discover concrete. And of course, that helped them create the most amazing transportation system of its time, actually. Until the 1700s, European transportation systems were not nearly as good as Rome. But also, they adopted or created new models of thoughts, new institutions, the Senate, the Republic, secular law. Many of the institutions that we still use essentially were first adopted by Rome. And it was, again, that combination that allowed them to dominate their world. And they were the first 1 million person city. So if you notice, Uruk is here, about 10,000 or so. Rome rose to about 1 million, but they all collapsed. Every leading civilization in history has collapsed into a dark age. So the question going forward is whether we're going to collapse or break through to a higher level. So let me get back into the 1900s. Let's talk about disruption. This is 1900, New York City, Easter parade. There is one horse in this picture. one car in this picture. Horses dominated transportation, essentially since Uruk and even before. This is 1900 New York. 13 years later, there is just one horse in that picture. New York went from all horse but one to all car but one in just about 13 years. That is the last major disruption of transportation. 13 years. And let me walk through the process of disruption and then come back to that disruption. There is usually a long equilibrium, and that can be 100 years or 1,000 years. So our grid has been around for 100 years, and it has been in equilibrium. Our transportation system has been around for 100 years, cars and so on, and they're all about to be disrupted. So what happens is we have an equilibrium, we have a convergence of technologies, and I'll go more into this, where entrepreneurs see what's happening. The convergence opens up a vast new possibility space, but not everybody sees it. Entrepreneurs do, innovators do, but not everybody does. So they enter the market, they create new products and services, they push costs and capabilities, and after a while, the system ruptures. If you see what's going on with electric vehicles, for instance, the system has ruptured the internal combustion engine transportation market. And then soon after that, the new breaks through. So if you have followed Tesla, in 2020, that company has broken through. And the old collapses. If you've seen coal, it has essentially collapsed over the last couple of years. So I created the Seba Technology Disruption Framework over the last 15 years to analyze disruption, to understand disruptions, and to anticipate disruption, which is the most important thing that we can do. So I'm gonna walk you through how to analyze and anticipate disruptions. The first thing that I look at is technology cost curves. So this, we know Moore's law in computing. We know that lithium-ion batteries are improving at a certain rate. Every technology improves at a certain rate. There is a learning rate. The more is deployed, the more we learn to use it, and we save money and we innovate and so on. But it's, so in the case of the car, if you look at the cost curves, in terms of dollars per horsepower, from 1896 to 1908, just 12 years, the cost per horsepower went down from 250 to 41. Now, why is 41 important? Because at that time, a carriage and two horses that you saw in that picture was about 10 times more expensive than the car. 10x has always enabled a quick disruption every single time in history. So why was the Ford Model T so disruptive? 10x, right? In 2014, this was my prediction for the cost curve of lithium-ion batteries. And folks thought that this was an insane prediction, as usually happens, right? But in fact, if you looked at reality at the time, and you anticipate that cost curve over the following 5, 10, 15 years, essentially you can see that I was right on the money. If anything, it was a little bit conservative. And so this is what you do. You look at the cost curve because you can analyze how technology is going to change everything. So I follow a number of key technologies, from solar to batteries to computing to blockchain and so on, that in my work, we can see that they're going to disrupt everything about society. But it's not just technology that enables disruption. It's technology convergence. What does that mean? So think about 2007, the smartphone. Why did both Apple and Google come up with a smartphone that same year, 2007? Not 2005, not 2009. That's because all the technologies that made the $600 smartphone possible converged in the year 2007. So that year, any of 30 companies around the world could have built a smartphone. Nokia could have done it, remember them? BlackBerry could have done it, remember them? So that was the year. The other lesson of disruption is that disruptions are caused by outsiders, right? From the edge, disruptions come from the edge. Neither Apple nor Google had ever built a phone before. And yet, they both built trillion-dollar companies based on the smartphone. So it's outsiders who enable disruptions. And in the case of the car, it was also enabled by a disruption. Rubber, tires, steel, combustion engine, and so on. All of these things converged in the early 1900s, and boom, there was that disruption. Now, S-curves, adoption S-curves. The car in the early 1900s went from almost nothing to 95% of the US market for transportation inside of 20 years. That's the whole US, not just New York. Within 20 years. And that was a quick disruption, as we know. But here's the most interesting thing. From 11% tipping point to about 81% happened in just 10 years. The bulk of the transportation disruption happened in just 10 years. Now, this is more than 100 years ago. Now things happen a lot more quickly. But it gets better. Not only did it happen in 10 years, it happened while we built two brand new industries, the oil and auto industry from scratch, right? So we built everything from scratch. We built a new road infrastructure. We fought World War I, and we fought the meanest pandemic in history. All of that happened within 10 years, and the disruption happened even despite all of that. So any excuse that technology disruptions can't happen, that infrastructure cannot be disrupted within 10 years, means that it's just an excuse. They're not looking at the real evidence. And like I said, and like you can feel, technology is going faster and faster and faster. And you feel it because it's true. All of these S-curves, it used to be S-curves, and now they look more like J-curves, right? I mean, success happens very quickly. Collapse also happens very quickly. Now, why don't we hear this from the mainstream, right? GE, let me give you that example. In 2000, GE was one of the premier industrial companies of the 20th century. And yet, in 2017 and 18, they nearly collapsed. They nearly went bankrupt. Their market cap went down by about $200 billion. Why? Because they bet on the thermal power market, gas, coal, nukes, and so on, right? This collapse of GE supposedly caught them entirely by surprise. How is that possible? How is that possible? Which is the question that I ask myself every day for 15 years. Why do smart people at smart organizations consistently fail to anticipate or lead market disruptions? And the answer, or an answer, is this: the linear mindset. Linear mindset. It's mechanistic, it's siloed, it's linear. They can only see through a peephole. They only extrapolate the surface properties of markets, not the underlying process of change. The linear mindset blinds us to the amazing possibility space that can open up in front of us. And this is an example of how the International Energy Agency has failed to predict the rise of solar throughout history. So every year they draw a straight line And every year they're wrong by 30 to 50%. Then they go back and they draw another line and they're wrong by 30 to 50%. And then they go back and again and again and again. They get it wrong by a lot year after year after year. Now, if you look at reality, which is the green curve, it's starting to look like an S curve, right? And even then, they're just drawing a line straight up, right? And it's not just the breakthrough technologies like solar, but also the down, right? There's S curve adoption for the new, and there's the inverted S curve for the old, for the collapse. So every year, the US EIA tries desperately to save the coal industry, saying, no, this year it's gonna grow, and coal collapses. No, but this year it's gonna grow, and then collapses. And then, no, but this year it's gonna grow, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the real curve for coal, it looks like a collapse curve. Now, business model innovation is every bit as disruptive as technology innovation. So we know Uber and Lyft and Didi, on-demand transportation, ride-hailing. Uber went from an apartment in San Francisco to more bookings than the taxi industry in America, the 100-year-old taxi industry in America, in 7 years. That's it, 7 years. Within 8 years of that apartment in San Francisco, they had 20% of vehicle miles traveled in many cities around the world. Within 11 years of being founded, they disrupted the car rental industry. 11 years, that's all it took. So again, anybody who tells you that a disruption, a major disruption in transportation cannot happen in 10 years is not looking at the evidence, right? And one of my previous predictions, that car ownership is going down, that essentially by 2020, I predicted new car sales, new gasoline car sales are going to peak. You can imagine what I was told. That is insane. And in fact, cars may have peaked 2019. I may have been wrong by a few months, or 2020, of course. The other really important thing to know about disruption, that the big disruptions, the 10X disruptions, are phase changes to a new system. What does that mean? So back to the car. At the time, the mainstream analysts would have told you that cars are faster horses, right? But of course, we know it's not the case. But the car was not a one-to-one substitution. Cars were 10 times better, 10 times faster. They could drive 10 times further, right? It was a brand new system with new capabilities. And not only did they eat horses, well, not literally, but the car market was 100 times bigger than the horse market, 100 times bigger. So it was a different system, different metrics, different properties, and 100 times bigger, right? So this is what a phase change means. And these disruptions have cascading ripple effects across society. It's not just that you have a new smartphone. That changes everything. So the convergence enabled the car, which changed everything in the 20th century. Geopolitics in the 20th century was about oil, which of course was demanded by the car. How we lived, how we dated before, suburbs, how we built cities, everything was affected by the car. So these disruptions have, there are no silos in disruption. There are cascading ripple effects across society. And with disruptions come changes in preferences. Now, it doesn't mean that you're gonna push for behavior change. Behavior is gonna change because of disruption. So back to the horse. What happened with all those horses that were disrupted in New York City? We ate them. Now, not you or me, but essentially transportation became food, right? We ate them. The horse was the clean meat of 1917, right? So behavior can change, preferences can change. And what's happening today is the same thing or a little bit different because of the smartphone. So the disruption of the internal combustion engine automobile is not just about the cost, and I'll get to that in a second. It's also about the value. The value of the car is being unbundled by the smartphone. So we needed a car to date and mate. Now we use apps. We needed a car to go to the movies. Now we stream it, right? Restaurants, groceries. We don't need a car for these things. We may want a car, but we don't really need it. So all of these parts of the value of the car are being unbundled already. So the car is being disrupted both from above and from below. There is also the idea of market trauma. Now, what is market trauma? So you'll hear from the mainstream consistently, don't worry, it's gonna take years or decades for solar or batteries or EVs or you name it to have a substantial market share. We know that's not the case, but this is what you'll hear and have an impact. But in reality, if you go back to GE, how quickly that company collapsed, profits and revenues. I mean, the company is still around, but the profits and revenues and market valuation collapsed within a couple of years, right? That is what I call market trauma. It only takes a little percent of the new to actually disrupt the finances of the incumbents. You don't need 50% market share to disrupt coal or gas or whatever, right? And we've seen this in energy. We saw how the Tesla battery in South Australia, with 2% of that, of the capacity of that market of South Australia, ate 90% of the revenues of that market. Repeat, with 2% penetration, 90% of the profits in that market disappeared. That is market trauma. And that happened not even in years, that happened in weeks. So again, the 100-year-old market got disrupted in weeks with only a 2% market share. So again, there's a long equilibrium. There's a convergence of technologies. Entrepreneurs, innovators rush in. They create new products and services. They push the cost and capabilities. They rupture the market. The new rises, quickly breaks through, and the old collapses. That is the pattern of disruption. Now, let me talk about the disruption of transportation. Now, back to 2014, when I published Clean Disruption, this is the cost curve that I said basically would happen or could happen with electric vehicles. 200-mile electric vehicles. I said that the market would offer along the blue line an EV with 200-mile range along that blue line in that time frame. Again, I was told that that was an insane prediction because at the time, a Tesla Model S was $80,000, right? And I said that by 2020, there would be EVs with 200-mile range without subsidies that would be cheaper than the median new car in America. An insane prediction, right? And that's happened. And I said that, of course, by 2030, it would be all over. When folks were saying 2050, and with government support and subsidies and behavior change and so on, I said, no, this is a technology disruption and it's gonna happen for purely economic reasons. But if you follow this, by 2025, there should be $12,000 EVs with 200-mile range. Think about that, right? And the market's taking it that way. And again, I was called insane, right? But in China today, you already have those cars, right? So it's already happening around the world. So if anything, this prediction may have been a little conservative. And that's normal. when you call a disruption, when you understand the disruption 5, 10, 15 years ahead of time. But essentially what this means is that no gasoline vehicles will be financially viable by 2025, not even 2030, 2025, right? So get ready for that. And again, this is not a one-to-one substitution. So folks are only talking about the initial price of vehicles. But in fact, EVs last 500,000 miles, whereas that's 3 times longer than a gasoline vehicle, 3x, right? And Tesla and GM and others have announced a 1 million mile EV, which is 7 times, right? I mean, if you use one car over 10 years, now we personally drive about 10,000 miles per year. But if you're Amazon and you drive 100,000 miles a year, 10 times more, or Uber, right? Then over 10 years, you need one EV, right? 1 million miles over 10 years, or you need 7 gasoline vehicles. So if you look at it that way, on a cost per mile basis, EVs are already ahead, right? And that's why companies like Amazon are going electric, because it makes economic sense for them to do that. This is why they're investing in electrification and autonomy and all that stuff, because it makes economic sense if you have a fleet. And of course, we know that an electric vehicle can power a house for 2 days, right? So if you have an EV today in Texas, you could be in good shape, right? And in fact, with EVs, you can actually not just power your home, you can power others, right? So if you sell to the grid, if you provide services to the grid, you can get paid for the battery in your car. Try that with a gasoline vehicle. Now, it's not just electric, it's autonomous. And I won't go into the details, but we see the media about dozens and dozens of transportation companies and even technology companies like Apple getting into the space. Why are they investing so much money to get into autonomous technology? And is it going to happen anytime soon? Now, let's look at the cost curve of supercomputing. So you need supercomputing in the trunk of the car to be able to drive it autonomously. This is the world's most powerful supercomputer 21 years ago, in the year 2000. And this was 1 trillion operations per second, right? So 1 trillion operations per second. And it was the size of that room. And it cost almost $50 million. So 1 trillion operations, 50 million. Now, if you have the Apple iPad now, you have 5 trillion operations per second for free. So we went from 1 teraflops for 50 million to essentially 5 for free, right? Same thing is happening to LiDAR. Even the iPad has LiDAR now, which is another technology. The other important thing to remember about autonomous technology, you see dozens of companies doing it. And some of them are saying, well, we won't be ready until 2025 or 2028 or whatever. Well, it doesn't really matter. Why? Because this is an operating system. This is a platform, right? Autonomous technology is a platform. AVs and EVs are computers on wheels. So if you look at the history of computers, you learn a couple of things. One is that you're not going to wait for 20 people to come into the market. Once you're ready, you're off to the races, right? Apple did not wait for anybody else before it launched the iPhone, right? So all you need is one, like a spouse. All you need is one, and you're off to the races, right? And the other lesson is that 2 companies are going to take 90+% of this market. So if you look at history, Windows plus Apple iOS plus Mac, Android and iOS, essentially two companies have taken more than 90% of those markets. And that's because of the network externalities, right? So maybe there's going to be a third, like Linux or whatever. But AVs, all you need is one, and you're off to the races. And in the end, there's going to be 2 or 3 companies that succeed. And when I talk about autonomy, I talk about anything on wheels. And this is not a one-to-one substitution. There are going to be all kinds of new types of vehicle that we haven't even thought about that are going to be autonomous. But all the vehicles, trucks, food delivery, wheelchair are going to be essentially, because this is an operating system. Everything is going to change, right? But I mean, again, you hear in the mainstream media about somebody who was killed 2 years ago or whatever. Are self-driving cars safe? Today, right, just to give you an indication, Teslas with Autopilot are 9.5 times safer than the average human being. 9.5 times safer today. This is not in the future. If we all if everybody in the world used that technology, EVs with Autopilot or equivalent, today we could save 900,000 lives every year that happen because of human-driven accidents. So anybody who tells you that this technology may not be safe, it's already safer than human beings. Now, I talked about ride-hailing, I talked about electric vehicles and about autonomous vehicles. The disruption is the convergence of those 3 things. On-demand, ride-hailing, autonomous, electric vehicles, AEVs. So think about an Uber or a Tesla or a Google robotaxi, owned by fleets. Why fleets? I'll tell you why. I mean, one, it makes more economic sense for them. But when the Amazons and the Ubers of the world use essentially transport as a service, the day that autonomous technology, level 4, autonomous technology is ready and approved by the regulator, essentially that day, the cost per mile. Now remember, it's a new system of transportation. It's not a one-to-one substitution. And new systems bring new metrics, right? So the metric for the disruption of transportation is cost per mile or revenue per mile. The day that level 4 autonomous technology is ready and approved, let's assume this year, 2021, the cost per mile of a Taas vehicle is going to be 1/10 of the cost of an individually owned car, whether it's electric or a gasoline vehicle. 1/10. Again, we've seen how 10x has always enabled a quick disruption every single time. So this year, if we have that task, the decision that an individual who wants to buy a car has to make is this: do I want to spend $50,000 over the next 5 years owning and maintaining a car, or do I want a subscription, a $100 subscription to Uber or Lyft or whatever? No brainer, right? By doing that, by not owning a car, initially your second or third car you're going to get rid of, and then your first car. Essentially, you're going to save $6,000 a year. Think about that for a second. So Taas is going to be cheaper, not just cheaper than owning a car, a new car. Even if you get a car for free, even if somebody gives away a car, Taas is going to be cheaper by 2 to 4 times than just the costs of operating a car, just the cost of fueling that car and insurance and so on and so forth. So this is a no-brainer disruption. Initially, you're going to maintain your car, and then at some point, you're going to be like, Why am I paying 4 to 10 times more for owning a car, right? So that prediction I made in 2017, and what we saw last year from Tesla is almost exactly what I said would happen. So Tesla is talking about their robo-taxi coming soon, and the cost per mile is going to be 18 cents, which is within the range that I mentioned 4 years ago. And that is going to happen immediately because 10x is such a no-brainer. Now, let's assume a 2021 or 2 or 3, basically level 4 approval in America. By 2030, 95% of passenger miles will be Taas. By 2030, I mean, it doesn't have to be approved this year. 2022 or 3 are fine. Why? Because this is a computer on wheels. You just download it. You just download the new operating system. So by 2020, so we're going to get rid of our cars. Like I said, first the third car, then the second car, and then your main car. 60% of cars by 2030 are going to be fleet, the Ubers of the world, the Lyfts of the world, and so on. 40% are going to be individually owned, but they only drive 10,000 miles a year. You know, a fleet car drives 100,000 miles. So by 2030, 95% of miles will be electric. And the implications are astonishing. One is the end of gasoline vehicles and also individual ownership. Financial, you're going to save $6,000 a year. Think about that. That's $1 trillion boost to the economy. That's equivalent to 10 to 18% increase in your wages, right? The fleet, the US car fleet, is going to shrink by 80% because you're going to have fewer cars driving 100,000 miles per year rather than a lot of cars driving 10,000 miles a year. So the fleet is going to shrink dramatically by 80%. We don't need new highways. We have too many highways, right? We're going to have a lot fewer cars within 10 years. The implications for the environment are also astonishing. 90% decrease in CO2 emissions by 2030. This is not going to cost. We're going to get money back, right? We're going to get $6,000 back, each one of us. Essentially, CO2 emissions are going to go down by 90%. Traffic, we're going to save 1 million lives every year that are caused by humans accident, right? This is going to happen by 2030. The implications for the oil industry are also dramatic. So again, 4 years ago, I predicted that oil demand would peak 2020 and then would drop to about 70 million barrels by 2030. Again, insane prediction, right? So the cost, the equilibrium cost for oil at 70 million barrels is $25. So I predicted that by the early 2020s, 2021, the barrel of oil would be 25 on the global markets, $25 a barrel. That sounded insane just 1 year ago. And we've seen what happened this last year. Oil went down to 20. Actually, it went down to minus 20, right? And demand went down to 70 million barrels, exactly as I predicted. Of course, it happened because of another disruption, but it happened, right? So like I told you before, when you see the possibility space, you see it, right? And the mainstream did not see it. Now they claim they know it all along, of course, but they could not see it. This was an insane prediction, which already happened. Land use, and this is really important for energy, because we're not going to own cars. Essentially, 80 to 90% of parking is going to be freed up. Think about that, right? The urban landscape is going to be redesigned. About a third of the landmass of cities, of modern cities, is parking, not people. Parking, a third, right? And most of that is going to be freed up because we're not going to need it. So the cities, the urban landscape be redesigned, right? Now, again, when I predicted in 2014 that 80 or 90% of parking would be freed up, that was an insane prediction, right? We love cars. Well, we saw that last year. US parking demand was down 90%. Of course, because of another disruption, but again, the key is to see the possibility space. The land use implication of the Taas disruption is amazing. So in LA, in the space freed up by parking, we could build by 2030 3 cities the size of San Francisco. Think about that. We could build the wealth of 3 San Franciscos in the desert that's going to be opened up by the parking disruption because of the Taas disruption. What are we going to do with all this land, right? I mean, affordable housing, check. Green space, check. More business, check. More energy, check, right? And this is going to happen within the next decade. So let me tell you now about energy. And I just published this about in October, and it's called Rethinking Energy. 100% solar, wind, and batteries is just the beginning. So that was the question that we asked ourselves. Is it even possible to have 100% an electric power system that is 100% SWB, solar, wind, and batteries? And if so, can we have it by 2030? So let's look at the technology cost curves. As we know, from 2010, over the last decade, solar and wind both have become so cheap that they're cheaper without subsidies than anything else. Coal, nukes, gas, anything else. Solar today, even the IEA is admitting it, right? After 30 years of being wrong, that solar today is the cheapest source of energy on the planet in history, not just today, in history, right? Solar is so cheap that nearly firm power, which means solar plus 4 hours of storage, or wind and 4 hours of storage, is not just cheaper than anything else, it's cheaper than the operating costs of conventional energy. Again, the total costs of solar plus storage is cheaper than operating anything else. Even if a gas power plant or a nuke were free, the costs of running it are more expensive than solar. It makes exactly no sense to invest in anything else, in any conventional energy today. Now, on top of that, we are expecting to see another 70% drop in the cheapest sources of energy. So we're seeing a convergence of solar, wind, and batteries. Remember convergence? And that convergence is going to get 70% cheaper over the next 10 years. So let's look at that. Solar dropped costs by 82% since 2010, so over 10 years. And we expect another 72% drop over the next 10 years. Wind, 46% drop over the last 10 years, 43% expectation over the next 10. Battery costs have come down. Remember my cost curves that were called insane? Well, battery costs came down by 87% since 2010, and we expect another 80%, right? Let me talk a little bit about God parity, because this is important when we're talking about distributed generation and storage. So throughout decades of the solar industry, we've talked about grid parity, which is the point at which, of course, you can self-generate at a cheaper rate than what you pay utilities. And we're there in hundreds, if not thousands of cities around the world. Grid parity, solar is already there in many markets. But the thing that's going to really tip this market is what I call God parity, generation on demand. Meaning the cost of solar and then storage is going to be so cheap, it is so cheap, that at some point it's going to be cheaper than the cost of transmission. So I want you to think about that. Even if you can generate at zero utility scale, when you add the cost of transmission, right, and CEO, salaries and so on, you can always self-generate at a cheaper rate than that cost of transmission. So at that point, it becomes in everyone's best selfish economic interest. By everyone, I mean families, residential, commercial, industrial, to have rooftop solar plus storage because it makes economic sense to them. And that's why you're seeing companies from Amazon to Apple to Google and so on going all solar, right? Because it makes economic sense to them. So back to the question, is 100% SWB possible by 2030? And if so, how much is it gonna be? So what we did, what my team did, was we took a couple of years of real world hourly solar plus wind generation. So we didn't just look at the weather, we looked at the actual generation hourly, and also the demand from those markets. And we extrapolated the generation to see how or if we could do 100% SWB, right? Because utilities will tell you, no, it's not possible, or they'll tell you it's gonna cost tens of trillions or whatever. And we started doing the analysis for New England, which has the worst combination of sunshine and wind resources, California and Texas. And what we found was astonishing. So let me introduce you to the clean energy U-curve. What we found was that, yes, there are thousands of electric power system designs that are 100% solar, wind, and batteries. Thousands of possibilities. Big possibility space, remember? But here's the thing. This is not a linear one-to-one substitution of the existing power system where you swap out a coal power plant and you swap in solar power plant. There is a non-linear trade-off between generation and storage. So this is the U-curve, and there is a non-linear relationship. What we found is that if your capacity for solar and wind are a lot larger than what we use today, then you can have a lot less storage, right? So there is a lot of propaganda out there about seasonal storage. We need weeks or months of storage between seasons. No, we don't, right? What we found was that this is the least cost system. So we have to choose one of these along the U-curve, right? But the least cost system has 4 times the solar plus wind capacity that we use today, right? So we have the peak, and this is 4 times. What we found for several markets is that the sweet spot, the least cost system, would need about 3 to 5 times more capacity than we use today. And in exchange, we need a lot less storage. In the markets where we've looked at, from Germany to India and here in the US, need anything from 1 to 4 days. We haven't found anything outside that, 1 to 4 days of storage. So in the United States, in these 3 markets, by 2030, if we start building that system today in 2021, the 100% SWB system is the cheapest possible electric power system, period, by 2030, right? It'll be cheaper than even maintaining the existing conventional generation system, right? In California, all we need is to invest $115 billion. Texas, just under 200. New England, 91 billion to build a resilient and robust 100% SWB by 2030, the cheapest possible system. If we do it all over the US, it would cost less than $2 trillion, which is over 10 years, 1% of GDP. With 1% of GDP, the US can achieve energy independence from conventional energy sources, period, right? And again, the new system, the 100% SWB, is a new energy system with new properties, right? So the car was not just a faster horse, right? The SWB system is not just cleaner, it is clean, right? But it's not just a cleaner conventional generation system. It's another system altogether. And if you look at the history, it's going to be dramatically larger than the existing one. I'll get to that. So in Texas, for instance, and we hear what's going on in Texas today, some of you are in Texas, 100% SWB system would include 49 hours of storage, right? 2 full days of storage. So even if all generation shuts down, the whole state can function normally for 2 whole days if you have a 100% SWB, right? But it doesn't have to shut down because there's going to be 4.9 times more capacity than they have now. 5x, even if half that capacity shuts down, it's still a lot larger than we use today in Texas, right? And the cost of that electricity is 2.6 cents. 2.6 cents. The whole system is going to cost that, 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Nothing else can compete with that. Cheaper, larger, more resilient, and more robust. Another key finding is what we call superpower. Super abundant, essentially free, zero marginal cost energy. What does that mean? So if you go back to our analysis, our simulation of SWB, because you need to plan the whole system for the worst combination of solar and wind resources, right? What you're gonna do is add a lot more capacity to the system. So the rest of the year, so you meet every single hour of demand, of today's demand, but the rest of the year, you generate up to 100% more energy than the existing system for free. This is free energy that is twice the size of the existing system. So in Texas, in 93% of days, they can generate not just the demand today, but up to 100% more energy. Did I say free? This is all clean, super abundant energy. Even in New England, you can generate in 64% of days, essentially superpower, up to twice what the existing system generates. So the new, because of superpower, so this is the incumbent mirage. The incumbent mirage is that the system that we have in 10 or 20 years is going to be essentially what we have now, plus or minus 10%. That is not going to happen. The lowest cost SWB system, which is cheaper, did I say cheaper than the existing system, is going to be dramatically larger and cheaper and clean, of course, right? Now, this is not about electric power disruption. It is about electric power disruption, but it's about disrupting all forms of energy. So 100% in California, SWB will generate both existing demand and superpower, right? So the existing demand for electricity is covered. And then all of this additional generation can cover, did I say for free? All the vehicle miles traveled in California if they were electric for free, right? And some need for residential heat. Now, interestingly, if you invest an extra 20% in that system, it can cover electric power, transportation, residential heat, commercial heat, and some industrial heat. Assuming, of course, that we electrify that we electrify residential heat and commercial heat and so on. So this is disruptive. SWB is disruptive to all forms of energy. In Texas, it would create superpower to cover essentially, again, all transportation if it were all electric, residential heat, commercial heat, and a lot of industrial heat, right? In any time of the year. It would cover every single hour of the year. So everything, every single thing, from heat to electric power to gasoline, will be disrupted by a 100% SWB, right? And the economics are unbeatable. You can't compete with the economics of superpower. Why? Because there are disproportionate returns to incremental investment. So once you build the least cost SWB system, if you invest an additional, say, 20%, you can create another 200 to 300% superpower. Think about that for a second. You invest 20% more and you get a return of 200% more. Where have you seen that? Not in energy. No form of resource energy can possibly compete with this, right? So they're going to be competing with photons and electrons. This economics, where you get disproportionate returns to incremental investments, is more like information economics. It's more like, Amazon Web Services. It's more like Google, right? Where the marginal cost of energy is zero, and an incremental investment in infrastructure yields, or could yield, a 10x. Now, let me show you how that works. New England, which again has the poorest sunshine combination of solar and wind resources in the nation, here's what it would generate with 100% SWB, with the least cost system, right? So it would cover all its electric needs and much of electric transport. But if they invest an additional 20%, right, this much more, they would get 210% more superpower. 20% additional investment, 200% more superpower. Where have you seen that in energy? So essentially, in New England, with the poorest resources, sunshine and wind in the nation, they could cover all of transport and much of residential heat with 100% SWB, with just a 20% incremental investments. Again, this is disruptive to everything else. And this is why we say that 100% is just the beginning, because additional investments are going to get you way more than what you can put in, just like information economics. Every time we have seen abundant energy, we have seen prosperity. Every time in history where we have seen abundant and affordable energy, we have seen prosperity. And this time is no different, right? So we're on the cusp of achieving super abundant, cheap, and clean energy. And that's super prosperity. That's the age of creation. This is the only way, right, for us to solve all the United Nations or most sustainable development goals, right? We can solve water. We can solve heat. We can solve materials. We can solve poverty, environmental degradation, right? This is the only way to do it, right? And did I say we're going to get money back for solving all of these things at the same time? Again, it's not going to cost a lot of money, like they say. We're going to save money. So to summarize the coming disruption of energy, 100% solar, wind, and batteries is possible by 2030. Not just is it possible, it's the cheapest energy system, not just electricity system by 2030 if we start investing today. The clean energy U-curve shows us that this is not a linear one-to-one substitution. There is a non-linear trade-off between generation and storage. And solar is so cheap that if we have a lot more capacity for solar, essentially we can have a lot less storage. And that's of course because today's, on a relative basis, solar is a lot cheaper, right? A lot more solar is a lot cheaper than a lot more storage, right? So there is that non-linear trade-off. Superpower, super abundant, zero marginal cost electricity is disruptive, not just to electricity, not just to coal and nuclear. Yes, it's disruptive to coal and nuclear and so on. It's also disruptive to heat, to natural gas heat, right? To propane heat, and all sources of heat. And because of the unbeatable economics, where if you invest an additional 20%, you get up to 200% more superpower, more resembling information economics, 100% is just the beginning. So let me summarize. We are on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of humanity in history. We saw throughout history how leading civilizations in the past, or briefly saw, went up to a higher order, 10x, right? Because of that convergence of technologies and organizing system. What we didn't see is that they collapsed after a while because they made the wrong choices, right? All of them collapsed, every single last one of them. And today we are essentially at the end of the industrial order that we started building about 500 years ago. But we have in the 2020s the key technologies that can make the age of freedom happen. We have the opportunity for the first time in history to elevate humanity, to create a new production system, and achieve the age of freedom. We can solve the world's most intractable issues, from poverty to inequities to environmental degradation, all at once, and get money back. To make this future happen, we must shift our mindset. The linear, narrow, siloed, mechanistic mindset is not going to do it. In fact, that mindset is exactly what every other civilization had that led them to collapse. Okay, we need to shift our mindset. We need to rethink the present, as we're looking at today, and the future, right? All the possibilities that are opening up in the future. We must accelerate the production system, the creation production system. Things like energy, 100% solar, wind, and batteries. Transportation, transport as a service. Food, precision fermentation. All of these technologies will allow for humanity to be free. They will cut the cost of our basic needs by about 10x. All production is going to be localized. Design is global. Development can be global, but production is local, right? So we'll achieve autonomous regions and cities. And this will enable humanity essentially to spend time with the things that we want to do, not the things that we have to do. We need to create the conditions for this new system to emerge. New institutions, new belief systems, new mindsets. so that we can enable the age of freedom. The people, the organizations, the societies that do this will successfully increase their societal capabilities, what they're able to achieve by 10x over the next decade or so, and break through to a higher order, to the age of freedom. So we have a choice today. You have a choice today. Do we want to go back and collapse? Do we want the linear mindset and collapse? Or do we want to break through to the age of freedom? It's our choice. Thank you.